Have you ever heard the statement that heaven and hell are both states of the mind? And I'm not trying to scare you or go into any sort of spiritual rant or anything like that, but I want to make a reference as to what living in the mind can feel like and why we are almost disposed to feeling like heaven or like hell when we are living in the mind. So let's make two different distinctions here. There's living in the mind, and then there's living in the body or living in reality in the present moment. When you're living in the mind, you are subject to varying extremes. So, for example, when you are associating and identifying with your thoughts, that means that any crazy, ridiculous, scary, disturbing thought can pop into your awareness, and you're going to identify with that thought. And that will be deeply unsettling and deeply uncomfortable because you're going to start to think that the thoughts that you didn't choose to think are somehow a representation of who you are as a person, when of course we know that's utterly not true at all. The same thing goes for any mind state, is that the mind isn't stable within itself. It doesn't have limitations for what can be experienced. Think about when you're going about your daily life, how rare is it that you would say you're encountering something that is complete and utter suffering? And for those who are living in that, they are probably not listening to this right now. In any case, we're talking about mental suffering. And for those of you and many people who are existing from a place of where you think your misery and your suffering is coming from some sort of mental factor, then this applies to you. So when you're living in the mind, hell is possible of being experienced in a much more likely manner because the mind is not limited to what it can imagine. If you are going to allow yourself to suffer at the hands of the mind's imagined circumstances, then there really is no limit to the amount of suffering that you may endure because your mind can conjure up any sort of situation, any sort of doomsday like hypothesis, and emotionally you're going to suffer at the hands of it. Rather than when you're living in the body, you only truly suffer when something horrible happens in your life. And when we want to think about things practically, the amount of horrible things that happen in the current present moment is far, far, far less than the amount that than the amount that you are able to imagine in your mind. You can imagine hell, but it is much more difficult to actually experience it, and it is much more rare to actually experience it in life. This is not to say that life and people have not experienced deep, dark, and traumatic times. But I want to make clear that what we're talking about right now is the world of the mind and how we suffer at the hands of the mind. Because a lot of time I get comments that are referring to, physical and real environmental challenges. And to that I say, yes, of course, but two things can be true. Someone's can be suffering at an inherently greater level. Someone can be suffering to an extreme level. And that does not negate the fact that there are also those who are suffering mentally. And the two don't have to be equal for them to be worth talking about. If someone is suffering mentally, why would we not alleviate that if possible? Do we not alleviate the mental suffering, even if it is imagined, just because there are those who are suffering more? There will always be those who are suffering more, and there will always be those who are suffering less. So I know when I say heaven and hell, those words sound radical, they sound extreme. But the picture I'm trying to convey is that your mind is capable of extreme highs and lows that reality itself is often not as susceptible to presenting you with. So if you're sitting in your room and you're imagining horrible situations, and emotionally to your nervous system, it's as if you are experiencing it, then you're going to suffer the stress, anxiety, fear, and all these negative things that come with living in your mind. What happens is when you get so used to living in your mind, you forgot what it's like to live in your body. And here's an interesting practice that I've done for a while, and that is that your autonomy, your free will, your beingness is better represented in moving your arms and your legs than it is in thought. Because your arms and your legs and your body you can control. You can't control all the thoughts that you have. You can't control the nightmarish situation that pops into your mind. So if you're going to find stable grounding, if you want to find peace, if you want to live in a lighter way that involves significantly less unnecessary suffering and imagined misery, then it's to come back into your body. And what you'll find is a lot of times your body has actually been asking for a lot of attention. Maybe you need to do yoga or movement or breath work, whatever it may be. That's kind of besides the point, but it is possible that in coming back into your body, you see that, oh, I actually need to do things that are going to ground me and put me in attunement with my body. I need to listen to my body. I need to exist in my body. So in moving our arms, we can see ourselves reflected like a mirror. So when you hear that voice in your mind, and I don't want to cause some sort of, hysteria when I say this. You don't have to hyper-analyze everything your thoughts say. You don't have to, you know, hyper-calculate any little thing and any micro wording that comes into your mind. But when you do get caught in the loop of overthinking, or you do get caught sort of living in the imagined scenarios of your mind, just look at your hands, look at your feet, move your arms, move your legs, and say, oh yeah, this is me being represented. I am the presence within the body. I am not the thinker. I am the presence in the body. I am the animating force in the body. And this is how we find our way to freedom. This is how we find our way out of the quote unquote hellish landscape of what the mind is possible of conjuring, any imagined dangers, any imaginary situations. If you're always dependent on the voice in your mind to represent you adequately, then you're always going to be one bad thought away from suffering. You're always going to be one disturbing thought away from a self-perception that is completely distorted. You're always going to be one thought away from creating a perspective of who you are that is completely inaccurate. And this is what happens when you live in the mind. And now let's transition into a space that might be slightly more, sorry, I don't know why I said more, slightly less intense. And that is how your mind and living in your mind throughout your life creates expectations. And you might feel as though a lot of times you're living life in a disappointed manner. Maybe you find yourself in a bad mood more often than not. And it's because we oftentimes are expecting life to reflect itself in the way our mind is setting things up and painting the picture for us, instead of just allowing life to speak for itself. And it is quite ambitious to think that all the scenarios we paint in our minds, or rather not that we paint in our minds, but that we observe our mind creating, is going to be extremely accurate with what life is really providing for us. The best way to go about it is, if you want something to go a certain way, realize that it's okay to be disappointed sometimes. You know, you could take the very spiritual, mindful perspective and say, get rid of all expectations. But we can take a slightly more balanced approach. We can take a more introductory approach and say it's okay to have expectations, but at least don't have expectations in any sort of certain way. You could say, I expect this thing to go well, and that's it. You don't have to, paint the narrative of exactly how it's going to look, and you don't set a lot of parameters for what that experience needs to be for it to be perceived as something that went well. Just say, I think it's going to go well, and that's it. Don't say, I think it's going to go well because this is going to happen, and then this is going to happen, and then that's going to happen. This is how we set ourselves up for constant disappointment. Because on a scale of 1 to 10, an experience might be a 7, but if you're always expecting every single experience to be a 10, then yeah, you're usually going to be let down for a lot of the time, and you might not be able to enjoy yourself as much as other people maybe, because you're living in your mind and you're not allowing life to unfold in front of you as it would if you were just living with presence. And living with presence and living in the body, they go they go hand in hand, because what we're doing is we're coming back into our sort of biological nature to exist. When you're living in your mind, you're in this very psychoanalytical space where the bounds are not very clear. The limitations are not set, and nothing is certain, nothing is fundamental, nothing is grounding. So when you're living in your mind too much, you're constantly going to be caught in some sort of storm, whether it's a really heavy storm, a really heavy darkness, or a little bit of a lighter storm, because you're always living in your mind. Go live in reality. Go experience reality. Associate with the fact that you're able to move your body and put the thinking to rest for a little while. And I can tell you firsthand that being void, even momentarily, being void of language in your mind, the thinking, the voice mind, it does not negate good ideas. It does not negate, you know, having a perspective. And I think we confuse that. We confuse not living in the mind with having no thoughts. Sorry, let me reframe that. A lot of people say, even when you're not living in the mind, you still have the thought, I'm hungry. But that depends on your definition of the thought. If you're going to categorize thought as any sort of mental inclination towards anything, then we need to get extremely descriptive with which the kind of thoughts that we're trying to detach from here. But I think you know the kind of thoughts that are bothering you. They're the unnecessary conversations. When you're hungry and you think of a restaurant, did you really say that restaurant in your mind before? You know what I'm trying to say? You didn't debate and obsess over a restaurant before going to eat there. You felt hungry, and then the impulse of a restaurant came into your mind, and so you went there. These aren't the kind of thoughts that we're talking about. This is a natural unfolding. This is what the mind was made to do. You're hungry, and your mind goes, oh, maybe this restaurant. That's how it serves you. It's helping you, and it's assisting you. When it's not helping you is when you are going back and forth with it. So let's say instead of just allowing yourself to be hungry and going to a place that you want to eat at, you suddenly start obsessing over the sanitary nature of the restaurant. Within good reason. If a place is serving, a gas station sushi, or in America at least, then, maybe that's not the greatest idea, whatever. But if you're obsessing over all the little details because maybe you have a fear or anxiety that's being triggered, those are thoughts that we need to detach from. And now, so what's a realization that you're going to come to when living in your body? And I can kind of forewarn this. Um, it's more boring, but boring is a good thing. It's more boring because you're going to see, oh yeah, there's not a constant war. There's not a constant crazy hypothetical. When you're living in your mind, there's always something going on. There's always a fear. There's always an anxiety. There's always an expectation. There's always a deliberation. There's always a debate. There's always something. But when you're living in your body, when you're living in the present moment, most of the time, there is nothing. Most of the time, you're just existing. And the mind needs to get adjusted to that. You need to be able to just let yourself exist, let yourself be bored, let yourself sit on the couch without looking at your phone. The phone doesn't help, might I add. I'm not telling you to get rid of your phone or anything like that, but if you're scrolling on social media for 3 hours a day, or no, sorry, not 3 hours a day, but if you do a scrolling session for 3 hours, that's gonna force your brain to work extra, extra hard. So then when you get out of there, you're gonna be so ultra stimulated that it's gonna kind of force itself to create its own scrolling. But instead of scrolling through videos, now you're scrolling through different thoughts, different daydreams, if you want to call them. And you need to get out of there, because just like scrolling on social media is extremely harmful because it knocks you off of your emotional regulation. And quickly, the reason that it does that is because if you can go and see one video of a cute kitten, that's nice. But then you see the next video of, you know, a literal war zone or anything else, and it makes your heart drop. And then you watch a really funny meme, and then you watch a really scary video, this is sending your emotions all over the place. It's completely distorting your grounding. It's completely distorting your sense of stability. And when we're living in our body and we're not scrolling like that, we're just kind of witnessing the things around us, there's much less going on. There's more reasons to be at peace. When you're on social media, there's more reasons to be anxious. There's less reasons to be at peace. And then when you're living in life, when you look at the things around you, it's oftentimes there's not much going on around you, especially right now. There's probably not too much going on around you, in the negative way at least. There's plenty of reasons to be at peace. So once we can make this distinction and start practicing, because of course it takes practice. It's not going to happen on day one. But if you start to lower the screen time, and every time you find yourself overthinking, you move your body a little bit, you stand up, you go for a walk, and you say, okay, this is the reflection. The voice isn't an adequate reflection. What you do with your body, that's your decision. How you move your body, that's a choice. That's a conscious choice that you can make. And you made that as an awareness. As a sort of aware force, you made that choice to move your body. You didn't make the choice to think a disruptive and nightmarish thought. You didn't. So how can it be you? You are that in which you choose. Because there needs to be a chooser. But there doesn't need to be a thinker for you to think thoughts. And I know that sounds wrong right at first, but think about this a little bit. Sorry, no pun intended. Your brain is creating thoughts. You can exist without thoughts. So there's not an inherent thinker. There's just the brain producing thoughts and the awareness and you choosing which thoughts to engage with. So there is no thinker in reality. There's the brain and then there's the awareness. But when you move your body, there's the awareness and then there's the awareness that made the choice. The awareness makes the choice to engage with a thought. The awareness makes the choice to move the body. That's what you are. You are the awareness within the body. And I know if we're not used to living like that, it can feel weird to live. And even maybe this is your first time hearing this concept, maybe it's not, but it can make sense to you right now. But what it's really hard, when it gets really difficult, is to actually bring this into our life. But this can completely transform our lives if we allow it to. If we do everything we can to live in the present moment, things will happen very quickly because your body and your mind, your nervous system starts to go back into the mode that it was designed for. Allowing yourself to be bored. Allowing yourself to just exist without distraction. Distractions create a very large spectrum of suffering that is possible. Because if you can distract yourself and forget that you are awareness, you are subject to the heaven and hell spectrum. But if you remember that I am awareness in the body, I am the mover of the body, I am not the thoughts, then you can find a much more deep sense of peace and realize that if I keep practicing living in the present moment, if I keep practicing aligning with my body rather than my thoughts, then I can forge a deep connection with my body from which it can ground me. Because the body knows what to do. It's biological. It knows how to exist. It's the mind that's going crazy. Sorry, not going crazy. It's the mind that's confused. It's the mind that doesn't know what to do. It's the mind that doesn't understand the new, fast-paced technological effects of scrolling on social media for 8, 10 hours a day, whatever it may be. How is the mind supposed to be equipped to deal with that? This is all relatively new. The internet is relatively new to the evolution of our body and minds. So you'll see, once you go back to sort of biologically what we were intended, I'm not going to say intended because technology isn't inherently wrong, but all within a balance. If we could practice bringing ourselves back into the body, into the present moment, this makes social media, this makes the internet not as toxic and not as applicable to making us feel a certain way, a certain misery, a certain suffering. That's it for today's video, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'm going to leave a link to my book down below. I talk about this and a bunch of other topics as well. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe. If you're listening on Spotify, thank you as always. And I will catch you guys in the next one. Peace.